Hello, people of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you from an undisclosed location, Midwest USA, to provide some insight into different corners of history. I don't know about the rest of you, but I have spent some time in a hospital before. When I was 3 years old, I broke my arm. My sister broke her arm twice, and so I definitely have seen my fair share of hospitals. But this got me wondering about American medical history, because let me tell you, sometimes it can be kinda gross. But anyway, that's actually how I feel about most of the human body. It's pretty gross. And the fact that people will willingly waste 7 years of their life at college to become doctors amazes me. But that is definitely a good thing because they definitely do need all that training. But anyway, as this is a podcast about American history, I thought we should dive into the history of the American medical field and hospitals in general. So please sit back and enjoy the ride as we venture into the history of hospitals and American medicine in general. As with most American history, American medical history is definitely not a straight line. There are many bumps and curves in the road to the modern age of American medicine. Now, the basic concept of a hospital started in 333 CE, when Roman Emperor Constantine I had been converted to Christianity. Until that time, disease had isolated the sufferer from the community. The Christian tradition emphasized the close relationship of the sufferer to the members of the community, upon whom rested the obligation for care. Illness thus became a big matter for the Catholic Church. That's right, we have Catholics to thank for the hospital system. You're welcome. And actually, for the next 1,000 years, churches had a definite hold on hospitals in Europe. That's also why, to this day, so many hospitals are named after Catholic saints. Fast forward to the 1500s, and the first hospital in North America was opened by Hernan Cortez, a conquistador, in 1524 in Mexico City. Now, as I'm sure you probably heard during your time on this earth, medicine has not always been an exact science, and doctors did not always necessarily know what they were doing. Medicine was honestly rudimentary during the early years of the American colonies, because very few higher class physicians immigrated to the colonies. Women played a major role in administering care in these early days, most especially when it came to childbirth. Mortality rates in those early days were extremely high, especially for infants and small children. Malaria was especially brutal, as was diphtheria and yellow fever. Most sick people were treated with folk remedies, though smallpox and inoculation was introduced early on, long before embraced in Europe. In these early days, there was virtually no government regulation or attention paid to public health. The first medical society was formed in Boston in 1735. Later that same year, the oldest American hospital was opened. Bellevue Hospital in New York City was officially founded on the second floor of the New York City Almhouse in 1736, 40 years before the American Revolution, and it has since been at the forefront of administering patient care and medical education. Also, Bellevue has a reputation for serving homeless, immigrant, or minority populations, while also delivering care to United States presidents. And it is still operating today. 15 years later, the first general hospital was established in Philadelphia. And in 1765, the first American medical school was founded, the Medical College of Philadelphia. And 2 years later, the medical department of King's College was established in New York, and in 1770, they awarded the first American Doctor of Medicine degree. And medicine was not an exact science during the early years of the U.S., when it was still doctors used treatments that today would be seen as absolutely barbaric and downright unnecessary. Many treatments would cause more harm than good, and particularly the popular practice of bloodletting. The uninitiated, that meant the withdrawal of blood from the human body, and it was used to cure many things, or thought to cure many things, would be a better description, I think, because it really did not cure many things. It was thought to help fever, hypertension, inflammation of the lungs, in some cases, excess fluid in the lungs, and it is thought that bloodletting may have killed George Washington along with his throat infection, which is listed as the cause of death. Another popular medical fad that is still used today, but not at the same level that it was before, were the leech treatments. Leeches were thought to help the bloodstream by However, these leeches weren't cleaned or sterilized in any way, and so they often, again, caused more harm than good. During the early days of leech treatments, they would usually go from one person to another rather than being sterilized. And as you can already tell, before the 1800s, medical training was much, much less formal than the large academic institutions of today, with most physicians being trained usually as apprentices. And by the mid 1850s, physicians started opening medical schools in affiliation with nearby universities. This increased the number of formal medical schools from only a small number to more than 40 by the mid 1850s. However, though the small number of medical schools increased, the education was lackluster at best and definitely needed improvement. And it should also be noted that during this time, hospitals were usually specifically for the poor. When middle or upper class people fell sick, their families nursed them at home. And often, even surgery was performed at houses, which, believe me, is definitely not sanitary. However, this would all change during, like a lot of changes during America, during the Civil War. We have the Civil War to thank for many, many medical achievements. It's been estimated that more soldiers died of disease than from fighting during the Civil War. The conditions in the Confederacy were particularly brutal due to great shortages of medical supplies and physicians. Lack of hygiene and cramped quarters brought along other problems like measles, mumps, chickenpox, and whooping cough. Diarrhea, dysentery, and typhoid also ravaged the South. However, the war did bring in a wave of progress in the form of surgical techniques, researching nursing methods, and care facilities. The Union Army built hospitals in every single state, and proactive medical organizers achieved considerable progress thanks to a well-funded United States Army Medical Department and United States Sanitary Commission. And it could be said the Civil War brought forth the modern hospital system. Civil War established an effective hospital system that treated the wounded and diseased through a series of continuously improving treatments and rehabilitation services. In the decade before the Civil War, American military action consisted of Native American skirmishes, and the few wounded were treated at the various forts in rather small infirmaries. In cities, however, hospitals were for the indigent and working class, as I previously stated, and had a reputation as places for one to die. It would not be until the last decade of the 19th century that hospitals were looked upon as places of healing. Chances are, if you went into one hospital, the only way you'd probably come out would be in a casket. Field hospitals took form soon after the first major battle of the Civil War, the Battle at Bull Run. Two armies met and effectively slaughtered each other. The North suffered 2,700 casualties, the South 1,900. It was a Confederate victory, and there was absolutely no organized ambulance system to remove the wounded or an organized medical treatment system to treat the wounded. So injured soldiers laid on the ground as long as 3 days on the battlefield. Local homes, churches, and other structures were quickly made into field hospitals. It was under the leadership of the Union's Surgeon General Alexander Hammond and his genius medical director Jonathan Letterman, MD, that an effective ambulance and hospital system was developed, and it became the standard military wounded care delivery system through the Second World War. It consisted of specific trained personnel in outfitted mobile field, brigade, general, specialty, and rehabilitation hospitals. In conquered towns, buildings were refitted as places to treat and house the diseased and the wounded. Hammond hired some of America's leading physicians as medical inspector generals to visit each and every hospital to ensure that a new standard of care and sanitation were met. Specialty hospitals were created, such as Turner's Lane in Philadelphia, to treat neurological disease, and Desmarais Hospital in Washington, D.C. for eye and ear disease. So this is really the era when we began to see specialized hospitals dedicated to treatment for different purposes. Prior to then, all illnesses were often lumped together. And by the end of 1863, multiple well-ventilated pavilion-style hospitals were being built in major cities, making room for up to 3,000 patients each. Letterman's ambulance corps was effectively functioning, and the wounded were timely removed from battlefields. Tent hospitals by the hundreds were prepared and set up at different battlefields, such as Gettysburg, and by the time the war ended in 1865, there were 204 Union General Hospitals with 136,894 beds. During the war, over 1 million soldiers received care in Union military hospitals, and maybe a similar number in Confederate hospitals. We're not exactly sure. Of course, one thing that set these hospitals apart from modern-day hospitals is sanitation. And I know it may surprise some of you to know this, but doctors have not always washed their hands before operating on a patient. And in fact, it did not become popular until after the Civil War for doctors to do so. It was on March 16th, 1867, that a 40-year-old doctor named Joseph Lister published an article that fundamentally changed medicine. It was titled An Address on the Antiseptic System of Treatment and Surgery, and it was a description of a new way of performing operations that he presented in Glasgow, Scotland, where he practiced medicine. At the time, germ theory was just that, a theory. Lister's innovation was simply to try to kill germs. He used a spray of carbolic acid on wounds, dressing, and surgical tools. He also washed his hands before operating on a patient. The acid killed the germs before they had the chance to cause infection, and the hand washing kept new germs from being introduced. He described the positive outcomes that the new way of doing surgery had for his patients. Wounded limbs could be unhesitatingly condemned to amputation because of the probability of infection may be retained with some confidence for the best of results. Abscesses could be drained, wounds could heal cleanly, and hospitals would generally be healthier places to be. As there appears to be no doubt regarding the cause of this change, the importance of the fact can hardly be exaggerated, he wrote. And although British and American surgeons were angered by this quote-unquote Scottish upstart, according to Harvard University, by 1875, sterilization of instruments and scrubbing of the hands were widely practiced. However, carbolic spray was exchanged for other antiseptics by 1885. Before this, bed linen and laboratory coats were not washed, and usually surgical instruments were only cleaned before they were put away for storage. The same probe that was used for the wounds of old patients during rounds to look for pockets of undrained pus would be used again after another person had used it. Death rates, as you can imagine, were extremely high, as I've said, and this proved that germ theory was a fact. And unlike many other medical ideas, this one was quick to catch on. By 1875, the sterilization and washing of hands were widely practiced. However, as I said before, carbolic spray was exchanged for other antiseptics by 1885. And the reason for this relatively quick and thorough uptake was because the circumstances were so profoundly bad in the field of surgery before Lister. You could only imagine how many cases of sepsis there were before this. And what have we learned here today, folks? Well, we have learned that before 1867, medicine was really gross, and in some ways it really still is, but at least there are less chances of bacterial infection now than there were during the Civil War. And with that, I hope I have enlightened you in some way on the history of the American medical field. Thank you once again. This has been Bowtie Talks with Luke Johnson. Goodbye and God bless.